Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rotten Tomatoes is Wrong on an incredibly bombastic, blockbuster, boffo box office episode of this show, Jacqueline. I mean, you talk about the all-time movies, and we've had some fun conversations recently, and they range from indie movies to some movies that did pretty well at the multiplex, but it's hard to top our subject today. How are you doing? You and I did get into a tiff right before we went to air.
Not right before, but close enough before. First of all, I will just say your Washington Football Club played valiantly. And I texted you some news that you may be the most well-funded team ever because Jeff Bezos is thinking of buying you. So although we won the day, you may win the war.
Please save us. And then we went from that battlefield into whether we disagree or agree on the brunch controversy. I'm not a brunch guy at all. Jacqueline is the leader of the brunch brigade. And maybe that's why we're bringing on a guest to be a third neutral party. But I think our guest has feelings on brunch as well as the movie we're talking about today, which is a little flick called Avengers Endgame. Have you heard of it? Yeah, we're celebrating the return of the MCU to theaters because The Eternals is out as of today, or at least tonight on November 4th when this episode is released. And it's going to be in theaters for quite a while because, again, it's one of these Marvel Cinematic Universe films that really expands the lore exponentially from what we've already known. And we thought Avengers Endgame does that because, again, it was called Avengers Endgame. It was the companion piece to Avengers Infinity War. And Endgame is still the second best reviewed MCU movie ever at 94%, which is obviously certified fresh, and a 90% fresh audience score. Our guest today is going to be the one, the only. You've known him from everything from us here at Rotten Tomatoes. He's always a friend of the show, from Screen Junkies, from the Movie Trivia Schmodown. He is the one, the only, the owner of Taco, or maybe Taco owns him, Lon Harris. You're a returning favorite, sir.
Hey, what a delight to be a favorite. How many times do you go somewhere and somebody tells you you're a favorite? That's
it's
special.
Never a brunch place for me. I'm not wanted there.
How do you not like brunch? Let's dive in here before we get into Rotten Tomatoes and whether they're right or wrong. You, sir, are wrong about brunch. It's a delightful meal.
All right, I might have to I'm going to have to welcome in producer Lucy in a little bit too, because maybe she can even the score with brunch. But before we hear from Lucy, Lon, maybe there is something you and I can agree on, and that would be your feelings on Avengers Endgame. Is Rotten Tomatoes right or wrong about that 94% certified fresh score?
Rotten Tomatoes is wrong about this movie. Hey, listen, I'm not saying it's the worst MCU movie, but it's certainly not, it's not S tier. It's not among the very best of the MCU. That's what you're talking about when you're talking about 94% agreement. That you're talking about the top of the pantheon, the essentials of this franchise. I don't think Endgame comes even close to that level.
All right, well, Jacqueline, it was almost like you could hear the brakes screeching because everybody was writing in to support Lon and yourself with their feelings on brunch. And then they were like, wait, what did he just say? So we're going to talk all things Avengers Endgame. We're going to get Jacqueline and I's thoughts as well on it. But before we get there, Jacqueline, I guess this is going to be a brief synopsis because if you didn't see Avengers Endgame yet, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I'm basically going to tell you who's alive, who's dead, and the basic bullet points. So Avengers Endgame is the second half of the final chapter of the first arc of the MCU, where we sort of see our folks that we sort of led up to the Avengers find their sort of final chapter in an Avengers movie, end of phase 3. You got Thor, you got Black Widow, you got Hawkeye, you have Hulk, you have Tony Stark and Captain America. So Iron Man and Captain America. At the end of this, Black Widow sacrifices herself. Tony Stark is dead. And everybody else is really sad. But also Gamora, one of the Gamoras disappears because folks didn't know the big thing about this particular installment is they used time travel as a way to thwart Thanos, who's the big villain from Infinity War. He did his snap. Half of the team sort of disappeared. The remaining team, after Paul Rudd comes out of the Quantumverse, comes together. They get together. They pull out a heist to steal time. And then Tony sacrifices himself with his own snap to bring everything back. And Iron Man. And the crowd goes wild. And and Captain America lifts Thor's hammer. There you go.
Yeah, Captain America lifts Thor's hammer, and then Captain America, not necessarily dead at the end of the movie, but very, very old and really
useless.
Not fit for combat. Yeah,
not fit for combat. Yeah, there
useless.
You go.
He's not he can still do day-to-day tasks.
Useless.
he's also atrophied. He spent the last 50 years just hanging out with his wife, being a wife guy in an alternate reality, just like letting Vietnam and 9/11 happen. Just like, listen, I got TV to catch up on. I missed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of albums that, I know, like Falcon didn't recommend a lot of classic albums. He's got Trouble Man in there, but listen, it's a lot of CDs to get through.
Yeah, I want to see the look on Captain America's face when he hears the Clash for the first time, and he says, "What is happening to music? This is not my rock and roll."
Like, that Zemo never mentioned this.
Yeah.
Let's go to Producy Lucy. You are on hand from your new palatial estate, so it looks like Bruckner Manor West is getting set up. Lucy, how do you feel about Avengers Endgame? Is it right or wrong according to Rotten Tomatoes? Wow.
That is one that I also had a hard time with, I will just say. Had a hard time with.
Okay, well, yeah, let's get into this because apparently we have Martin Scorsese as our guest today. So, Lon,
yes,
you aren't a fan. It's unfair to say you're not a fan of this movie, but you think that it's too high on the Tomatometer. So let's get into this. Why is Rotten Tomatoes wrong?
Well, if we're talking about me and my preferences with this franchise, I think what really makes the MCU work is they have this kind of framework. They have this tone figured out. It's a way of telling these stories that I think it translates from the comics into movies really well. And I think that really gets highlighted when you have really good, like, origin stories, like stories that explore these little side pockets of the universe that get to develop their own sort of world within the larger MCU. So your Thor Ragnarok, so your Iron Man 3s, your Black Panthers, even Shang-Chi, I think, was a recent really good example of this, of like, they don't feel exactly like all the other MCU films, but it still feels recognizable. And I think that when you can find that balance, like Taika Waititi did in Thor Ragnarok, where it feels like he's doing his own thing. It's got its own personality and look, but it's also like, well, these are the characters I like. This is moving the MCU story forward. I think with the big team up stuff like Endgame and Civil War and Age of Ultron, you get so bogged down in the like larger universe of storytelling. And this movie, Endgame, is like a good season finale that's not a good standalone episode of the TV show. You know, like in a season of The Sopranos, it's like the second to last episode is the best episode of the TV show because it's the one that works the best as its own thing. And then the finale is like, all right, wrap up all these stories because we got to see next season. And that's what Endgame feels like to me. It's like, all right, wrap this stuff up, give the people like the catchphrase they wanted to hear and finish this up. But the other stories that are getting you along the path are a lot more interesting on their own.
Are you accusing Endgame of being the last movie, which would be the last top number one on Dave Letterman's top 10 list? Because number 2 is always the funniest joke, and then number 1 was just some cheesy thing to get you out of here. Jacqueline, there's a lot of slander going on right now with Endgame between Producy Lucy and Lon. Your feelings?
Not that. Look. I think when you get to the top or the bottom of any of these lists, it is very subjective unless there is like a glaring thing that you can maybe point to be at the very top or at the very bottom. So I'm not going to like come against you guys for being like, oh, this is too high. But I would argue whatever you're going to put higher than that, there are just as many flaws that you can argue against. So there's just no reason. There's so much There's so much fire and fury. This was hard. And I do think with this particular film, you have to score it for the difficulty. This is Simone Biles being able to do tricks that other people can't. You know why we don't have a comparable film to compare what it's like to be the finale installment of a multi-billion-dollar franchise told out in chapters over a decade? It's because no one else is able to do it. And so it is ridiculous to even think about trying to compare this to those other films. They didn't have to do the same things. Those other films only had one task: tell a good story, maybe introduce a couple characters, but, fill your installment. So yeah, the directors got to have a little bit more fun and do a play around. The mandate, as it were, the assignment of Endgame was Herculean, and trust, they understood the assignment. And I think that has to be factored in.
I'm right there with you, because I feel like the bar that you had to get over for this movie, where some movies in the MCU, the challenge was like a sixth grade science project, where it's just show us the basics, show us you have a competent understanding of how to tell this story. And then this was like building a rocket ship, because you had so much going on. And in this day and age of intense scrutiny amongst the projects and properties we love, the fact that we had to pick up from 5 years, we had to do a post-Thanos snap, return of everybody, and then we also had time travel, and we're throwing all of this into the Vitamix just to make it believable for the time we're watching the movie's impressive. So I really think that this movie had a very high hurdle to get over, and I think it soared marvelously through that, no pun intended. But let's talk to Tim Ryan now, because Tim Ryan, our expert review curation manager here at Rotten Tomatoes, always has his finger on the pulse of what the critics were saying at the time this movie was released, which was back in 2019. We were so young. Tim, take it away with this segment we like to call 2 Minutes with Tim.
2 Minutes with Tim.
Avengers Endgame had the nearly impossible task of tying up every thread from multiple phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, giving dozens of beloved characters their chance to shine, and delivering a giant blockbuster that worked on its own terms. And guess what? By almost every measure, they did just that. Avengers Endgame is certified fresh at 94% with a whopping 547 reviews, and it has a 90% audience score. And it also made all the money at the box office. So what did the critics have to say? In a fresh review, Kim Newman from Sight and Sound wrote, "The last real battle pretty much has to be the most satisfying superhero movie set piece of all time, delivering the multiple closures this long in the telling saga needs." However, in a rotten review, Anthony Lane of The New Yorker wrote, "You can easily duck out during the middle hour, do some shopping, and slip back into your seat for the climax. You won't have missed a thing." The Rotten Tomatoes critics' consensus reads, "Exciting, entertaining, and emotionally impactful, Avengers Endgame does whatever it takes to deliver a satisfying finale to Marvel's epic Infinity Saga." So that's Endgame. Jacqueline, Mark, this is the podcast of your lives. You are going to make a good podcast. Whatever it takes. Back to you, folks.
Thank you, Tim, for that very snappy recap of what the critics were saying at the time. So let's get right into this. It is time to transition into movie talk. Brian, hit the music. The power that I wield. It's like I have my own Infinity Stone when I can just command the great Brian Perez to play music at my whim. So let's get into this, Lon and Jacqueline. We're talking about Endgame here, and this is, like Tim said, arguably the biggest blockbuster of all time, depending on re-releases and how many times Avatar's been back in theaters versus how many times this has been back in theaters. They may be going back and forth for a while, but everybody saw Avengers Endgame, and the reason is because this felt like the closing of that saga. We're going to get plenty more stories in the MCU. The Eternal's a great example, but this felt like closing the chapter on that initial cast of characters that we loved. So is this the greatest spectacle in the MCU, and is that why it let you down, Lon? Or was it just how could they have done Endgame where it would have been more satisfying to you, is I guess the question, given the task at hand that Jacqueline and I had referenced?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the key question. I think what they set up with Infinity War and Endgame was a very difficult thing to do narratively. And I think that, like what you guys are saying is not wrong. The idea that this was a very hard thing to do. You had this incredibly long running franchise and you had to wrap it up and put this kind of button on it. I just feel like it's a participation trophy thing to be like, well, it was so hard to do. They slumped across the finish line. Bravo, here's your award. I feel like, if we're talking about this as a movie, as its own movie, not as the button on this, if we're talking about, is Rotten Tomatoes wrong about the MCU as an entity, I would have a different opinion. That's what I'm saying. But in terms of this as a movie, I do think as spectacle, there are obviously moments and sequences that work. I don't think this has some of the best in terms of just action scenes of the MCU, but I do agree that last 20, 30 minute huge battle, it's a very good recreation of what reading a big comic book is like that shot with all the portals opening, you feel like you're looking at a splash page from a comic rendered cinematically. To me, the highlight stuff of the MCU isn't, oh, that perfectly replicates a comic book, because we already have comic books. It's when they take the raw materials of a comic and turn it into something that works best as a movie and feels like cinematic and original to the movies. And that's what I think Endgame sometimes struggles. Like the Captain America fighting himself sequence should be so much better than it is. It just, I don't know. It's like, it's kind of flat on the movie screen. I do like the big portal sequence. I think that as pure spectacle, here's all the characters we've introduced over the past decade fighting each other in this big battle royale. Like, that's what the fans wanted, and they certainly delivered on that moment.
And there was some pretty great footage that I guess Marvel or maybe somebody else took. It felt like it was official footage, not pirated, which is why I can celebrate it here. It might have even been at the premiere in downtown
cheering at the moment when Cap
everybody
grabs
going
Mjolnir.
crazy when all those portals open up, because that's exactly how I think we all felt watching it, Lon, is it was like you're a kid and you're looking at this huge splash page in a comic book, and it looks amazing.
And that's one thing they did strategically and cleverly was, Cap never says Avengers Assemble. He almost says it in all the other movies leading up to this one. Like, they teased it because they knew that would be a huge thing to pull out at this big moment. Same thing with the Thor's hammer and who's worthy and those questions. Like, they planted these seeds and then they were admirably patient in waiting for them to pay off. So, like, in terms of those details and moments that they sort of seeded through the franchise, of course, that then emotionally pays off at the very end.
What's the scene for you, Jacqueline, that you say this is why Avengers Endgame did get over that high bar it had set for itself?
I think the reason why I can say that is because even though it was doing a lot, every single character had their own particular moments to shine. And some of the moments that I enjoyed the most were from characters who haven't gotten their standalone. Basically, what I'm talking about is Mark Ruffalo's Professor Hulk, that whole thing. But yeah, no, I really loved how they took where that character was throughout the story. And basically, when he's talking through that scene where Mark Ruffalo talks through his idea of why he's able to control the Hulk better and how he no longer feels this need to divide who he is. I would have loved to have seen that in a standalone film, but I really felt that was like a great moment. Also, probably not the most PC choice, but I lived for Fat Thor and everything that he did.
I'm right there with you.
Thor was the man. When he got his hammer back, I shed a tear.
Come on, we gotta go. 3, 2.
No, wait!
What am I looking at?
Oh, sometimes it takes a second.
I actually, as a heavyset gentleman, I didn't have a problem. I know some people did, and I'm not trying to discount their problems with Fat Thor. It is a subjective thing. But my worry was they were going to like magically slim him down for the big finish. And the fact that he got to stay Fat Thor and still be a badass at the end, to me, redeems the whole concept. Like, it's about he was still worthy. Like, even when he was a bigger guy, he was still worthy. And I thought that worked really. Even as the resident disliker of this movie, I wanted to jump in and defend Fat Thor.
Well, it just felt real to me, seeing that scene. And so I would talk about it on stage around the time the movie came out, where, like, look, if that's who your friend has been, then yeah, there should be no shaming going on. You accept them for who they are. But if your friend was literally a god from Asgard who was the most shredded human being you had ever, or shredded being you had ever met, and they suddenly started letting themselves go, drinking kegs of beer a day and playing video games, you might have a word or two with them. So seeing Lebowski Thor is so... It's a great moment for me because it highlights the comedy that has been a hallmark of the MCU up to that point, as does seeing the professor version of the Hulk, where he's taking selfies with fans at a diner, and it's cute now because this Hulk couldn't control himself at all before, and now he's just taking pictures with fans. You see Lebowski Thor, you have these the time travel barbs about, wait, so like, what is this, like Back to the Future? It had the comedic elements, even going through that fight scene, Lon, with the Captain America fighting himself when he says that's America's ass. It's like, this is the comedy that I have come to expect from MCU, but I also felt the weight of the snap, the Thanos snap, where we see Citi Field where the Mets play, and it's just so run down and decrepit. And then we go to support groups where we're talking about who we lost in the snap and then welcoming everybody back. That felt real to me. That felt gritty for an MCU movie.
I think that stuff actually is some of the stuff that works the best about the movie, because that's when it's really telling an original story. It's like, well, what impact would this have had on the world after all these years? I think so much of the movie then becomes that, like, looking back, snake eating its own tail, like references thing, like where we're at with the Halloween movies, where it's like, let's go back and discuss who lived in every single house in Haddonfield. And like a lot of the time, my stuff kind of feels like that to me, like, oh, let's go back to every single action beat we've had, even from the movies people don't like. Let's go back into Thor: The Dark World and hang out there for a while. And it, like, that's the stuff that doesn't, the stuff that's like, let's look at the world 5 years after and see emotionally what this has done to people. That's interesting to me. Like, I would be in for a whole movie in the depressed 5 year ahead future. I think that's because now you're telling a story.
I call shade, and I have an objection. I have a huge objection. First of all, they literally went back to, at that time, although we'll see what happens, the lowest rated and probably one of the most maligned Thor movies. Definitely a most maligned Thor movie, and probably one of the most maligned in the MCU. And they found a way to not only make it vital, make it important, but make it feel that some of the storytelling aspects that people disliked were both vital and important. And that, to me, says that they weren't just trying to be self-referential. If they wanted to be self-referential, they would just go back to the airport scene of Civil War. They would go back to all of the, like, best, most rousing moments. But instead, they actually picked some of the smaller moments with Tony's dad, the moment with Loki in the final part of Avengers is definitely one of the bigger ones. But I don't think that is true. I think they were very specific and very strategic. And Thor: The Dark World, that would not be the way to go. I'm just sorry. I call shade on that. That's just too easy a cop-out. It was difficult, I think. And I think they picked moments that fans would appreciate, but also maybe moments that fans will now learn to appreciate because Endgame gave them that runway.
Well, it's probably maybe because of his extra padding that Thor was not one of the characters that we lost in that final battle or in the lead up to the final battle in Avengers Endgame. But y'all, we did lose some good soldiers that day. Who was the death in this movie? And it doesn't have to be at that final battle. It could be a Gamora. It could be Black Widow. Who is the death, starting with you, Lon, that you felt the weight of? Or maybe, because you're not as high in this movie as I am, was there a death that you felt maybe shortchanged and didn't do service to the character to that point?
I think Black Widow's death is the one that, like, it feels the hardest to take. Like, obviously, Tony's death is the big emotional climax of not just this movie, arguably the MCU. I thought, it, especially in terms of performance, Downey Jr. nails that moment. I think it's a good moment. Black Widow's death, I'm not sure I feel the same way about. Mainly, in the moment when I was first watching the movie, felt like, oh, obviously it's going to be Hawkeye. It should be Hawkeye here. And I still sort of feel that way. Like, I know that there's that man has a family, like there's that thing, but I don't know. It feels weird that Black Widow's the one who has to sacrifice herself in that way without ever getting sort of her story doesn't get to sort of close. She doesn't get her emotional climax moment. She doesn't get the moment of recognition where the team comes together and says, you know what, you did become this leader and you were sort of the head of this family, especially in the post-snap era. Like they almost kind of get there towards the very end. There's that one beat where they remember her by the lake, I suppose. I don't know. It feels like she gets kind of the short shrift. And I think even if you make the case that, that man had a family and it has to be Hawkeye, you got to figure out some way for Natasha to get her final hero's goodbye rather than just, jumping off of a cliff.
What's the death for you, Jacqueline, that you either felt very emotional about or were expecting to get more teary-eyed over?
Well, I'll back Lon up a little bit on the Black Widow one, just to be like, look, you're up there with Hawkeye and Black Widow. And although it looks like the Hawkeye series is going to prove me wrong, I hope they had scripts for that when they made that decision. Because at that moment, I was like, this is not a decision. This should not be this hard a decision. I mean, I know he had a family, but girl,
come on. Come on.
Seriously though. For me, actually the death, I guess that I felt kind of got the short shrift is actually Heimdall. He had a hero's death, don't get me wrong, but I just felt, and it was probably Idris's scheduling conflict, I just feel like that particular character started off very strong in the beginning of the series. And by his end, it just felt like he never really truly got his due. He always felt like a car that was shifting into a higher gear that never went to the higher gear.
I totally agree with that. Like in Ragnarok, there's like you cut away to those scenes of him on Asgard, like saving the people. And it's like, this could have been a whole subplot. Like, we also haven't ever left the palace on Asgard. That would have been so cool to see more of that. I agree.
But hey, I get it. There's only so much time in these things, but actually his was the one that I specifically, because when I look at what they did with Loki, who was a traitor, and granted he became good later, he got a better send off than Heimdall, who's been nothing but a loyal Asgardian the entire time. And I think that was it just didn't always sit right with me. Yeah.
And I can see where you are coming from with a couple of those deaths, because first of all, that death to me, the death of Heimdall felt like, okay, this is how much service each character who's not a core member of the MCU is going to get, where it's like you get to pop in and say hi. And so from that regard, Lon, I feel your point where it kind of felt like the last episode of Seinfeld. We're just going to put everybody on trial, and everybody's going to get one more quote in, and then we got to move on because we have so many people to either say goodbye to or set up their stories for the future. But it did add up to the emotional moment that I feel was properly weighted with Iron Man, where you get the snap and you see how impactful this person has been, not just to Spider-Man, although, Peter Parker's the one who's right there, but to everybody, not just the people on screen, to us, the audience, who, again, without that vibrant personality, without the greatness of that first movie, we don't get any of these other things. So I really did feel that, not just in the moment where he sacrifices himself by snapping, but then afterwards, where we do get another very comic book panel-like shot of the funeral of Tony Stark. I thought that was so well done, where they're all just kind of standing there, lost in their own thoughts, and the camera's slowly panning back and forth. And it really hits you in that moment, the journey that we've been on the last 10 years with these people.
So I thought I'd probably better record a little greeting in the case of an untimely death on my part. I mean, not that death at any time isn't untimely. This time travel thing that we're going to try and pull off tomorrow, it's got me scratching my head about the survivability of it all. That's the thing. Then again, that's the hero gig. Right? Part of the journey is the end. What am I even tripping for? Everything's going to work out exactly the way It's supposed to. I love you 3000.
Photoshop layers come to magical life. None of those people. They were all separate, right? Those are plates that are being laid over one another for that scene,
I always
right?
get nervous when it's a shot that's a still for that long, because I'm like, oh, man, are we gonna pull this off? Am I gonna cry before
Like,
we're done with
Howard
this?
the Duck is back there. It's like a de-aged De Niro from The Irishman behind them.
There is a lot of emotion to chew on in this, and maybe it's too much at times, but you can't really talk about Endgame without talking about either the greatness, which I just assumed everybody felt about that final battle scene, which is 30 minutes or whatever, because the initial rush that you get when the portals open and everybody comes back, it's like, we've been waiting for this. We've had this tantric experience trying to get to this moment for not just since the end of Infinity War, but really since this whole shebang began in 2008. So let's talk about whether that hit the moment for you. Did it pay off like you wanted it to? Jacqueline, you mentioned that you had some thoughts on when all the women of the MCU unite to start kicking some.
Yeah, if I have like a literal like lean my head back eye roll moment to give you perspective, that was pretty much my entire position through the last installment of Star Wars. But the moment that gave me that was when the women team up, and I guess they got the glove at that point, and they're like, she'll have help as she needs to like take this, across the battle lines, and every female character of the MCU all team up to sort of play keep away with the evil dudes. And listen, do I want to see the women of the MCU team up? But that was so contrived and so forced and so just placating. It's like, dude, seriously, like, we know what you're doing on this one, and it's not cute. It's so not cute. Every single woman involved in that deserves better. No. It felt wrong. And I felt bad for every single, there are Oscar winners in that group. There are people who have Oscar statues at home that had to participate in that scene. And I feel for them. I really do.
Do you think that was
bad.
the strategy going in, was that they got together, like they're all in the portal, like they're about to go into the gladiator pit in ancient Rome, and they're like, all right, so we're going to run this strategy in this play, and then we're going to get all the girls to do this, then all the guys are going to do this? Do you think that was their plan going in, Lon?
Yeah, I think they were standing back there like, trying to figure out like what's gonna have the most impact. I think all the monks come in first, and then once all the magical monks are out, then I think we have some ladies come out. I think that's good. I think that sends the right message. And then I think like it does. It feels coordinated in a way that feels. I think Jacqueline's right. It feels a little fraudulent. It feels contrived to create this moment rather than this is how a battle would realistically play out. I think to me this is one of those like it's a show don't tell thing. Like, let us know that you stand for representation and diversity and all of these wonderful things that we want by doing it, by just baking it in to the franchise, so that you don't need to have these like showy moments of like, look, there are women in these movies. We should just implicitly know there are women in these movies because you work them in all the time, and it doesn't need to be this like one big spotlight moment and then we go back to like the men folk fighting. Like that's kind of what it feels like.
Was this more or less emotional on the whole, because I'm still trying to wrestle with this myself, than Infinity War? Because I feel like a lot of people, well, whenever they talk about Infinity War, they sort of, just reference Empire Strikes Back, because that's what apparently the law says we have to do when we're talking about a more deeper emotional story in a big blockbuster franchise. Does that make Infinity War better because we did leave on such a sour, weird, scary, foreboding note?
There is one thing I do prefer about Infinity War to Endgame, and that's that it feels it's Thanos' story, and I feel like it's got a little bit like more momentum in that way. That it's like here, we're following this. We're getting to know him over the course of him acquiring these stones, and I think it gives it this kind of very compelling through line that sort of pulls you through the rest of the story, which is also, some of my same issues with Endgame, where you're kind of just being pulled around to every end of this universe, and some stories are getting like a little bit of the short shrift. But I do like that Thanos really emerges as the central figure that we're keep returning to over the course of Infinity War and like exploring. And also Thanos is just more interesting in Infinity War. Like, I think him being this like ideologue who's just wrapped up in his plan and can't see that it's cruel is more interesting. By the end of Endgame, he's just like, well, you guys didn't like my plan, so I'm just going to like destroy the whole universe. That's just like a less interesting, I'm mad at you for not liking my ideas, is less interesting as a motivation than like, I've got this crazy philosophy that's just really homicidal and weird.
Well, he does turn into more of just your normal reductionist villain by the end of Endgame. I'll give you that. But in Infinity War, Jacqueline, I mean, there's moments where Thanos is making points, and I'm like, I don't hate the idea of voting for this guy in 2020.
Wow. No.
Yeah, I would go that, I would go that far, folks.
Okay.
No, never. I'm not about that life. But the one thing I will say, I don't know if it's Thanos necessarily, but the effects of his work in Endgame, I also feel is unappreciated. Like when they're in their like post-snap support group with like Chris Evans, and he's like talking about how like the whales came back. The ripples of what he did are like hard to ignore, that there were probably some benefits. And I guess they get to play with this, what they call now the blip. They didn't call it the snap. We were the only ones that called it the snap in the post part of the MCUs after Endgame. But yeah, man, I just remember being in a theater when they were like 5 years later. I literally gasped. I was like, whoa, like there's a gravitas to what he did that is felt in Endgame, even if his character is not as compelling.
You just think about the emotional weight of human beings, where it's like we had just gotten used to having less people around on Earth, and we had said goodbye to our loved ones, and we're doing these support groups, and we're trying to make our way, but we're figuring it out, and then everybody comes back. I mean, the economic ramifications, the infrastructure breakdowns that would occur if suddenly everybody who disappeared in the blip comes back at the same time. It would be chaos.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Captain, what was it? The Captain Falcon and Winter Soldier series on Disney Plus. It was sort of about this, like teasing out like the refugee crisis and how the sort of UN would be dealing with all of these people returning and that stuff. So that's interesting.
Well, we are going to work on the behind the scenes talk now, because there is some interesting stuff to chew on. So, Brian, let's make that transition into our next segment. All right, so this movie obviously did very well at the box office, and it became, again, arguably the biggest film in history, depending on which re-release you want to stop the grosses at. Avatar or Avengers Endgame, by hundreds of millions of dollars, surpass anything else that has ever come out. When we look back at this movie, can we get another one like this? Or is this going to be sort of a landmark achievement, even in the MCU, where there's going to be big movies, there's going to be big event movies where we reunite the cast of a bunch of different movies? Is it ever going to feel like Avengers Endgame again? And I know that we're very new into this world of Shang-Chi and the Eternals, and we're waiting to see what the rest of Spider-Man's career looks like. Are we ever going to get an Endgame again, Lon?
I mean, I think to sort of reiterate what you both were saying at the top of this podcast, like it's very hard. It's very hard to get the football this far down the field, let alone across across into the end zone. I got all my football terms.
You got to just break the plane. Yeah.
But exactly. But I don't think it's impossible. I know there are fatalists out there who are like, that's it. We'll never build up to this level of a climax. Again, it was, a decade plus, all of these movie stars and characters. I don't necessarily agree. I think we've got the X-Men on the horizon. I think we've got Fantastic Four on the horizon. I think there are, people are very, very hyped around Venom and this Sony Spideyverse we're building out over there. And I think that there's still enough threads, there's still enough characters that Marvel has to play with in their sandbox. And now with all of these TV shows, I don't necessarily think it's impossible to see, 5-7 more years down the road, them being able to build up to the next version of this with a whole new generation of heroes they've introduced and gotten everybody hyped for. Like, I doubted them before, and I've learned my lesson. I won't doubt them again.
All right, Jacqueline, Lon teed you up perfectly. Do you want to be a fatalist and say we're never getting another Endgame?
No, we already have one. And the next installment is their Infinity War. Fast and the Furious, baby. It's longer. And they are coming. They are trying to get their final, like, Infinity Endgame. And trust me, they went to space the last time.
Yes, they did.
I think they're definitely, it's a multiverse in Fast and Furious, for sure. There's no doubt in my mind by the end of that, Dom's meeting an alternate reality, Dom and Toretto family. It's happening. Get ready, folks.
Yes. And they're going to do dinosaurs, too. Because the only thing studios love more than IP is cross-promotion. And that is where I think the next installment can go. They've been to space.
They've already got the Jurassic World franchise. There's no reason
Jurassic
not to cross
World.
these over.
This is how we're going to have
in there.
See, this is what the MCU does to people, is it poisons our minds to think that everything is going to be this giant team up. I think it's fair to say it's going to be tough to get another Endgame, and I think it's going to be even tougher than it was the first time, because now these sort of questions are being asked this early. We weren't asking these questions. We were just hoping to one day see the core team of Avengers on screen fighting in New York together when Iron Man was launched and when Thor came out. And so now to have the weight of these expectations from Endgame placed on newer characters, or even existing characters that we have to pivot from, like the Black Panther universe, there's a lot of buildup that needs to happen. And so I would say let them have their time, let them breathe, and let them, or as organically as you can, build back up to something as epic as that. But we are going to transition, to our mailbag segment. But before we do, last licks on Avengers Endgame. Lon, you have the floor. Anything about the movie behind the scenes that you want to get in as a parting shot?
You know, I would say I think that the MCU, it's this great platform for these kinds of like weird individual little, like the Guardians of the Galaxy movies to me are like the perfect, that's the seamless blend that the MCU could provide. And Endgame is just like, I don't know, to me, not being like a diehard Marvel Comics, like I grew up with these as a kid, like to me that it's just not as satisfying. It just feels like we got to throw the entire kitchen sink at this movie and hope that some stuff sticks. And I just feel jerked around by it.
Jacqueline?
I don't feel jerked around by it. Look, do I understand that the MCU has pitfalls and faults, and there are aspects to it that remain frustrating, and it's difficult now with so many previous installments for them to push past their lineage, I would say. But I would still argue like a bad Marvel MCU movie is 10 times better than what anybody else is trying to put out within that realm. And you take the bottom 10 MCU movies and go walk it over to another studio that's not too far from that's located in Burbank, and they would kill. They would kill to have the critical and box office reception of those. And they've done it with characters who, truth be known, were considered the runts of the litter. Like, these were not the characters that you were supposed to make $1 billion franchise out of. So it's simplistic if you say, but man, looking back on it, it's a singular effort. There's a reason why people haven't been able to recreate it, though many have tried. It takes way more difficulty and foresight than any of them have, and you got to get really, really lucky.
Yeah,
and
I'll not tolerate this dark universe slander. All right.
I am a proud Universal employee. I am not gonna in any way. I'm a proud NBCU employee. I'm not gonna in any way shade the Universal Dark Monsters franchise.
The Bride of Frankenstein.
Yeah, Lon, I was going to say, once Angelina Jolie's Bride of Frankenstein comes out, we'd love to have you back on the show.
Yeah, I'm super on board. We got Depp is the Invisible Man. We got a lot of plans.
We got Wolfman. They just announced.
That's right, yes.
Ryan Gosling, Wolfman, Angelina Jolie, Bride of Frankenstein, and then they also have Chloe Zhao directing Dracula with no name yet.
Give it all to me and hook it in my veins. Just don't kick it off with the weird Tom Cruise mummy. Just give me that Russell Crowe, Dr. Jekyll movie to start everything. Make him the Nick Fury of this and just start from there. We'll get back. Someday we're going to do an RT is Wrong episode just on that Tom Cruise mummy so we can talk about what could have
probably
been.
Right. I feel like RT's probably right about that one.
It might be pretty right. Well,
I feel like they're probably dead on.
When you get to Endgame, you start looking at it and you start talking about the modern era of movie watching and movie reviews and everybody having their say on social media. Pretty stupendous effort that it's 94% certified fresh and a 90% audience score with all of the weight that was heaped amongst its shoulders. So that is our discussion of Avengers Endgame. And now we're going to transition to our mailbag. We love it when our esteemed Ketchup Crew members write us. You can email us anytime. rtiswrong@rottentomatoes.com. If you want to get in touch with the show, let us know your thoughts. Let us know what movies you think we should be talking about, such as this email from our member, Iram Prabowo. Hi, Mark, Jacqueline, and Producer Lucy. Greetings from Indonesia. Have been a listener since the first episode. I'd really love to hear your thoughts about Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. That movie, in my opinion, is the best movie about any of the U.S. presidents that has ever been put to film, fantasy or otherwise. Would love to hear you guys talk about this. Stay awesome, guys. Cheers, Iram. Well, thank you very much, Iram. I would love to talk about Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. That's a hot take that Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter possibly even better than Steven Spielberg's Lincoln. There are moments in Abraham Vampire Hunter that are actually terrifying to me. There's some good in that movie. Do I have any disagreement?
No, there's good in that movie. Look, this is where I was trying to divide it. I don't want to be one of those girls, the book is better, but I got turned on to the writer of this, Seth Grahame-Smith, because he wrote a book called Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, which is really dope. And this one is not as dope as that, but there's a lot of good source material. I wish both of those could have had the day that they needed, because they were both incredible historical mashup concepts. I just wish that they would have gotten it. So I have like a weirdness with Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. The book is so good. And so although I don't feel the film is as bad as the score would tell you, I'm still like, man, they should have done this better.
Yeah, I mean, Lon, we always ask our guests to bring us a movie recommendation. Is Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter going to be yours?
It would not have been my top recommendation. No, I don't think it's like a total loss. I feel like it's a great premise and concept and source material, and it's an okay execution. I think it would be better with a different maybe director with a little bit maybe a one more pass on the script. It's like just tighten it up. And I don't really love it's one of those movies from that era where it just looks very like kind of animated and it's very like CG heavy. And I feel like a little bit more making it look a little bit more like the period and a little bit less hyper stylized might have helped.
We're living in a post-300 world at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
it had to look like a comic under life. It is interesting how close this movie opened to Steven Spielberg's Lincoln. They were like within a few months of one another. And I'm wildly divergent takes on.
Checking my notes here, and yes, Mary Elizabeth Winstead was Mary Todd Lincoln. So yeah, it's automatically a good movie. Lon, it's always a treat when you and your beloved pup Taco come and visit us here at Rotten Tomatoes is Wrong. Taco had some thoughts in the background. If you're watching this on one of our streaming platforms, Taco gets animated about the MCU, and I'm not sure how Taco feels about the Eternals, but that is the MCU movie that is opening in theaters this weekend. What is Lon Harris working on right now? What do you have going on in the world that we can all go check out?
Well, you should definitely check out my podcast. One is called Binge Boys. That's myself and Hal Rudnick. We watch a bunch of streaming shows, and then we yell at each other about them. Often I yell at him because he's wrong about them. Sometimes he yells at me. And then my other show is Garmin Showsia. I host that one with Drew Grant, Video Drew from the Schmodown. And that I would just talk about whatever was going on with us that week. It's pretty freeform. So both of those are Spotify, iTunes, or Apple Podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts.
And if you're not recommending any of our former presidents destroying monsters in a movie, what would be the Lon Harris recommendation of the week?
There's a great movie. It just popped up on Hulu. So if you have Hulu, you can watch it for free right now, or with your Hulu subscription, called Censor. It's from the UK. It is a horror movie. It's set during the video nasties era of the 80s. It's about a woman who works as a government censor, and she comes to believe that one of the horror movies she's censoring has like information about her childhood and her sister's disappearance. And it's a very cool, like, psychological horror film from the UK. Check that one out.
Have you heard of this, Jacqueline? It sounds like a in the mouth of madness sort of thing.
I have not heard of this.
It's a little bit of it in the mouth of madness sort of thing.
I love movies that I haven't heard of, especially ones where I feel like this is my brand of weird. And I feel like this is my brand of weird.
Yeah,
so
it's a great, like, descent into madness harm. Like, if you liked Saint Maud a year or two ago, it's like in that. Maud. It's like in that Saint Maud, like, person slowly becoming increasingly unraveled sort of deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you see,
I dig
like
it.
that stuff.
This is the beauty of this show. We can spend an hour talking about the biggest movie of all time, Avengers Endgame, but then we can throw some movie recs at you of stuff that nobody's ever heard of, or maybe we can just talk about Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter. You
also good, also enjoyable.
Rate and review this podcast wherever you enjoy podcasts. Whatever platform you enjoy this on, make sure you do whatever they ask you to do to get this up there and get more people's eyeballs on it and their eardrums. Thank you, as always, to all of our members of the Ketchup Crew who are listening right now. Again, you can email us, rtiswrong@rottentomatoes.com. And next week, Jacqueline, it's going to be a pretty exciting episode.
Yes, we have a special guest joining us next week talking about a movie that I feel has had its day of redemption, but it will be so great to discuss it. And that is Jennifer's Body with special guest Connor Franta. He'll be talking about his new book and discussing all things Jennifer's Body, a movie that has risen from the ashes, if you will.
I have not seen it, and I'm looking forward to watching it for the very first time. And I'm looking forward to cracking open Connor's book because I just got it in the mail. So I have some fun ahead of me this weekend, and that's going to do it for this week of Rotten Tomatoes is Wrong. Thanks once again to our very special guest, the not at all delinquent, the very professorial Lon Harris, his trusty mate Taco, Brian Perez, our engineer, Producy Lucy, Producy, my incredible co-host who does enjoy brunch and the Green Bay Packers and other things that winners in life do. That is Jacqueline Coley. I am merely Mark Ellis, and we'll see you soon at Rotten Tomatoes is Wrong.